January 1942. The Pacific was a vast, restless expanse, its waves dark under the cold dawn. A thin mist hovered above the water, carrying the scent of salt and diesel. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese lookouts scanned the sea, binoculars trembling in anxious hands. They expected the full force of the American fleet. But the massive silhouettes that should have dominated the horizon never appeared. In their place, smaller ships crept across the water, seemingly vulnerable, deliberately scattered. The Japanese captains whispered reports to their commanders, their confidence wavering with each passing minute. Every radar ping, every distant silhouette was a question mark. The Americans were supposed to be cornered, predictable. Yet the patterns were wrong. On board the USS Enterprise, American sailors moved with quiet precision. Each maneuver calculated, each radio transmission coded. The decoy fleet glided into position, designed to provoke, to mislead, to draw eyes away from the real strike force hidden miles away. A single misstep by the Japanese could cost them dearly. But from the mist, all they could see were shadows, illusions, and the unnerving certainty that something was not as it seemed. The tension was palpable. One fleet's cunning deception would soon leave an entire armada stunned. By early 1942, the Pacific had become a chessboard of fire and steel. The Japanese Empire, emboldened by its rapid conquests in Southeast Asia, had secured key positions across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Its naval forces, particularly the Combined Fleet, commanded a formidable presence in the region. Battleships and aircraft carriers prowled the waters, their crews seasoned by early victories and confident in their dominance. Across the ocean, the United States was reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor. The destruction of battleships and airfields had left the American Pacific Fleet in disarray. Commanders faced the challenge of rebuilding strength while defending scattered outposts across thousands of miles of ocean. American strategists knew that outright confrontation with Japan's seemingly invincible fleet was risky. Innovation, cunning, and deception would be their greatest tools in leveling the playing field. Japanese naval intelligence, relying on scouting planes and reports from their forward bases, believed they understood the distribution of American forces. The assumption was that the Pacific Fleet, though battered, remained largely visible and vulnerable. Japanese captains plotted courses and calculated maneuvers based on this understanding. Every dispatch, every observation, reinforced a growing sense of control over the theater. Yet beneath the waves, the United States Navy was quietly preparing a different kind of operation. Instead of meeting Japan in direct engagement, American planners began to consider psychological and strategic deception. Small flotillas could be used as decoys, fleets that would draw Japanese attention, create false impressions of strength, and mislead enemy reconnaissance. This approach relied not on brute force, but on subtlety, timing, and intimate knowledge of Japanese expectations. The strategic environment was further complicated by geography. The Pacific's vastness meant that fleets could remain hidden across thousands of square miles. Islands became observation posts. Coral atolls doubled as temporary bases, and cloud cover provided both shelter and danger. Japanese captains, though experienced, were forced to navigate this unpredictability with limited information. A single misjudgment could leave an entire squadron exposed. Meanwhile, American intelligence analysts worked tirelessly to interpret Japanese movements. Signals were intercepted and decoded, radio chatter monitored, and ship positions logged with precision. Each piece of information fed into a broader strategy aimed at creating uncertainty within the Japanese command. The challenge was immense. The Americans had fewer ships, fewer experienced crews, and a desperate need to strike without provoking a full-scale, uncontrollable engagement. The psychological landscape of naval warfare was shifting. Japanese officers were accustomed to straightforward confrontations where superior numbers and firepower determined victory. Deception, feints, and misdirection were not common tactics in their doctrine. By introducing false fleets into sightlines, the Americans could manipulate perceptions, causing Japanese captains to hesitate, misallocate resources, and make critical errors, all without firing a single shot. This period also saw the emergence of technological constraints. Radar was limited, reconnaissance relied heavily on visual spotting, and long-range communications were slow and vulnerable to interception. In such conditions, a carefully orchestrated illusion could appear real, while a real fleet remained hidden, undetectable, until it was too late. The stage was set for a confrontation defined less by direct firepower and more by the art of misdirection. Thus, as January 1942 progressed, the American Navy quietly positioned its forces. Decoy fleets, smaller, less threatening-looking ships, would sail predictable paths designed to draw Japanese attention. Hidden miles away, the main carriers waited, ready to exploit any opening created by Japanese overconfidence. The seas were calm, the winds subtle, and the tension unspoken, but the coming days would test every assumption, calculation, and intuition on both sides. From the vantage of Japanese captains scanning the horizon, the water seemed deceptively empty. Yet every shadow, every ship on the horizon, was part of a carefully constructed ruse. The stage was set for confusion, surprise, and the kind of strategic audacity that would define the battle to come. While Japanese captains felt confident in their knowledge of American positions, reality on the Pacific was far more complex. The U.S. Navy, though weakened, had adapted quickly. Commanders understood that direct confrontation against the well-entrenched Japanese fleet could be catastrophic. Instead, they sought to exploit intelligence gaps and force miscalculations. Decoy operations became an integral part of this evolving strategy. Fleets designed not to fight, but to deceive. American planners studied Japanese reconnaissance patterns closely. Reconnaissance planes typically operated along predictable paths, and the Japanese relied heavily on visual confirmation over long distances. This predictability created an opportunity. If false fleet positions could be presented convincingly, Japanese captains would be compelled to respond, often overcommitting resources to the wrong targets. The decoy fleets, composed of older cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels, were deliberately arranged to appear as a substantial strike force. From a distance, their formations suggested aggression and intent. The geography of the Pacific itself played a critical role. Islands such as the Solomon Chain and the Gilbert and Marshall Atolls offered both concealment and observation points. Japanese planes patrolling these regions would report sightings of the decoy formations, unaware that the real carriers were hundreds of miles away, hidden behind the curvature of the sea and dense weather systems. The U.S. Navy also exploited radio silence and coded transmissions, further masking the true fleet locations. Every maneuver was calculated to create maximum uncertainty and anxiety among Japanese commanders. At the same time, Japanese strategy was focused on neutralizing American forces through overwhelming offensive action. Their intelligence officers anticipated that any fleet movements would signal an imminent strike. The decoy operation leveraged this expectation, turning Japanese confidence into vulnerability. Captains had to decide whether to commit ships to intercept the apparent threat, often without full information. Each choice carried the risk of exposing a real vulnerability elsewhere. The Americans also relied on timing and weather. The decoy fleets moved in patterns designed to coincide with limited visibility, early morning mist, and shifting wind conditions. Even subtle cues, the wake of a cruiser, the silhouette of a destroyer against a rising sun, were carefully orchestrated to exaggerate fleet strength. Radar limitations on Japanese ships further amplified these illusions. Where technology failed, psychology filled the gap, creating a perception of danger that was deliberately overstated. On the Japanese side, captains exchanged reports and orders with increasing urgency. Conflicting information arrived from reconnaissance planes, coastal observers, and radio intercepts. Some reports indicated large concentrations of American warships. Others suggested minimal threat. Uncertainty spread quickly through the command chain. Decisions were made hastily, often without the benefit of verification, and fleets diverted to investigate phantom threats. In the heat of these calculations, the Americans' true objectives remained hidden, allowing their carriers and strike groups to maneuver unobserved. The Americans' meticulous preparation extended to drills and crew readiness. Sailors aboard the decoy ships followed precise protocols, ensuring that even minor details, such as formation spacing, engine sounds, and visual signals, contributed to the illusion. Every action was part of a narrative, a story being told across the waves, designed to mislead and manipulate. Japanese captains, trained to respond to overt signals of aggression, were now actors in a carefully constructed deception. By the end of January 1942, the stage was fully set. Japanese captains believed they understood the battlefield, their assumptions reinforced by visual sightings and intercepted communications. The Americans had positioned decoy fleets in key sight lines, while the true carriers remained hidden, ready to strike at a moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability. Every variable, weather, reconnaissance, crew readiness, timing, was synchronized to produce confusion and misjudgment. In this delicate balance of perception and reality, the Pacific waters became a theater not only of ships and guns, but of illusion and strategy. The coming engagement would hinge on timing, observation, and the ability to manipulate human expectation. For the Japanese captains scanning the horizon, the decoy fleets would soon appear larger, more threatening, and more real than the Americans they had assumed to know. The tension between perception and reality set the stage for multiple perspectives on the event, from the human and tactical to the technological and leadership angles that would define the unfolding battle. On board the Japanese ships, captains and crews experienced a mix of confusion and apprehension. The early morning mist obscured their vision, yet each sighting of the American decoy formations seemed to confirm the presence of a much larger fleet. Orders were relayed with urgency, yet each message carried a degree of uncertainty. Junior officers scanned the horizon for confirmation, while radar operators struggled with ambiguous readings. The human cost of misjudgment was immediate. Hesitation could mean vulnerability. Overcommitment could leave another flank exposed. Japanese captains, many seasoned in early war victories, faced an unprecedented psychological challenge. They were trained to respond to visible threats, but the decoy fleets created a paradox, apparent danger where none existed, forcing them to question every assumption. The fear of ambush gnawed at decision-making, slowing response times and creating tension among officers and sailors alike. Each misstep, however small, amplified the stakes, making the Americans' strategic illusion as effective as any artillery strike. From a tactical standpoint, the decoy fleets operated like living chess pieces. The Americans used predictable patterns, deliberately designed to lure Japanese vessels into observation zones. Movements were synchronized with reconnaissance flight paths, ensuring that each ship sighted by Japanese planes reinforced the illusion of an aggressive formation. The decoys' spacing suggested concentrated firepower, yet their true purpose was subtle: to draw enemy attention away from the real carriers lurking beyond the horizon. Japanese tactical response was hampered by incomplete information. When reports indicated large concentrations of American ships, captains had to allocate destroyers, cruisers, and reconnaissance planes to investigate, often leaving other sectors unprotected. The decoy fleet's feints exploited these decisions, forcing Japanese commanders to stretch their forces thin and divide attention across multiple perceived threats. In effect, a single, strategically positioned illusion reshaped the operational map without a shot being fired. Technology played a critical role in the success of this deception. Radar was still in its early stages and limited in range and resolution. Japanese ships relied heavily on visual identification, signals, and reconnaissance flights. This technological gap created fertile ground for manipulation. The Americans leveraged optical illusions, formation arrangements, and radio silence to project false strength. Even the wake of a destroyer or the smoke from a cruiser's funnel could be interpreted as part of a larger, menacing force. The use of coded communications further enhanced the deception. While Japanese intelligence intercepted messages, the content was carefully structured to mislead. Dummy orders, false coordinates, and misleading signals fed into Japanese assumptions, reinforcing the idea that the decoy fleets represented the main strike force. Technology, though limited, became a conduit for psychological warfare, amplifying the effectiveness of the Americans' human and tactical planning. Leadership decisions defined both sides of the engagement. American admirals understood that indirect action could achieve what brute force could not. They coordinated the decoy fleets with precision, anticipating Japanese reactions and leveraging overconfidence against them. Every captain and officer aboard the decoy ships followed meticulously rehearsed protocols, ensuring the illusion's credibility. Japanese leadership faced a far more chaotic challenge. Commanders had to interpret incomplete, often contradictory information, weighing risk against opportunity. The decoy fleets introduced a variable outside traditional doctrine, forcing decisions under pressure and uncertainty. For many captains, the realization that their expectations might be wrong came too late. Leadership effectiveness became a matter of perception and anticipation, rather than raw firepower or ship count. The psychological impact on Japanese crews was profound. Sailors, accustomed to confident navigation and predictable engagement patterns, suddenly faced uncertainty. Reports of large American formations caused hesitation and second-guessing at every level of command. Morale, usually bolstered by early victories in the Pacific, wavered under the strain of ambiguity. Captains feared ambushes that did not exist and doubted the reliability of their own reconnaissance. Every sighting of a decoy ship seemed to validate an exaggerated threat, sowing doubt and tension among the ranks. From the enemy's perspective, the Americans' strategy was audacious. Japanese intelligence officers struggled to reconcile conflicting reports, and misinterpretations of the decoy movements led to unnecessary deployments of ships and aircraft. This moral confusion, though intangible, had tangible consequences. Fleets were diverted, defensive positions weakened, and Japanese operational cohesion frayed. The Americans' ability to manipulate perception without firing a single round demonstrated that warfare was as much psychological as it was physical. The logistics of deception were equally crucial. Decoy fleets required fuel, supplies, and coordination with hidden strike groups. Every maneuver had to consider timing, distance, and resupply capabilities. For the Americans, maintaining the illusion meant moving ships in patterns that were believable yet sustainable. Supplies had to be routed without revealing the position of the real carriers, and radio communications had to be carefully controlled to avoid accidental disclosure. For the Japanese, logistics complicated their response. Ships sent to investigate perceived threats consumed fuel, diverted from strategic locations, and risked overextending their supply lines. Every misallocation created operational vulnerabilities that the Americans could exploit. In a theater as vast as the Pacific, the invisible costs of movement were as significant as visible losses in battle. Deception, in this context, was not only psychological, it was a weapon that forced the enemy into logistical inefficiency. From an operational standpoint, the decoy fleets reshaped the battlefield without engaging in direct combat. By drawing Japanese attention and resources to false targets, the Americans gained freedom to maneuver their true carriers, positioning them for maximum strategic advantage. This operation highlighted a shift in naval doctrine. Success was no longer measured solely by firepower, but by the ability to control perception, timing, and information. Japanese operational planners were compelled to adapt, but their assumptions remained rooted in conventional naval engagement. The Americans exploited this, creating conditions in which Japanese fleets were reacting to illusions rather than reality. The decoy fleets demonstrated that information dominance, understanding what the enemy believed versus what was real, could dictate the outcome of an engagement as decisively as guns or armor. Taken together, these perspectives illustrate why the decoy operation was remarkable. Human psychology, tactical innovation, technological limitations, leadership decisions, enemy perception, and logistical planning all intersected to produce a moment of strategic brilliance. The Japanese captain's stunned reaction was not the result of superior American firepower, but of a meticulously orchestrated manipulation of expectation and perception. The decoy fleets reshaped both the immediate battlefield and broader naval doctrine, proving that cleverness could rival conventional might in the vast Pacific theater. February 1942. The morning sun barely pierced the Pacific mist as Japanese lookouts scanned the horizon. Reports of American ships in formation had reached fleet commanders hours earlier. The decoy flotillas, moving deliberately in seemingly aggressive patterns, were visible yet elusive, enough to provoke concern, enough to distract. Japanese captains, convinced that the primary U.S. strike force was approaching, repositioned their cruisers and destroyers to intercept. On board the USS Lexington, American officers monitored Japanese maneuvers with quiet intensity. Radar and reconnaissance planes confirmed that the decoy fleets were drawing attention, and the main carrier task force remained concealed beyond the curvature of the ocean. Timing was critical. Any deviation could alert the Japanese to the ruse. Every movement was choreographed, every visual cue carefully engineered. Sailors maintained strict radio discipline, allowing only prearranged signals to be sent. The decoys became living illusions, part of a larger narrative that the Japanese were reading but misinterpreting at every level. By mid-morning, Japanese aircraft had been dispatched to scout what they believed to be a significant American fleet. Spotting planes reported large groups of ships moving in formation, reinforcing the perception of an imminent strike. Captains ordered destroyers to advance and screen the supposed carriers. Yet, as the hours passed, reports from different reconnaissance flights conflicted. Some saw empty stretches of water, others saw small ships scattered across vast distances. Confusion deepened. The psychological pressure on Japanese officers intensified. Decisions had to be made quickly, often based on partial or inaccurate information. Some captains hesitated, fearing ambush. Others overcommitted to intercept the decoys. As formations shifted to engage phantom threats, the Americans' true carriers edged closer to their targets undetected. The decoy operation had reached its peak effectiveness, manipulating enemy movement without a single direct confrontation. At 11:30 a.m., the first glimpses of the real American carriers were reported by Japanese reconnaissance planes, but too late to prevent their strategic positioning. By the time the fleet realized the deception, the decoy fleets had drawn significant portions of Japanese forces away, creating gaps in coverage and exposing critical vulnerabilities. The illusion had forced the Japanese into reactive tactics, giving the Americans the initiative. The decoy operation also revealed weaknesses in Japanese communication. Conflicting reports between fleet commands delayed decisions, causing divisions in deployment. Some ships were left out of position, unable to support neighboring units effectively. The Americans' careful orchestration ensured that each miscalculation by Japanese captains compounded the effect of the previous one. By controlling what the enemy believed, the U.S. Navy had effectively rewritten the tactical landscape. Amidst the fog and tension, sailors on both sides remained unaware of the full picture. On the Japanese vessels, fear and anticipation gripped crews as they adjusted to the perceived threat. On the American decoy ships, precision and discipline maintained the illusion. Every signal, every maneuver, reinforced the narrative designed to mislead. By mid-afternoon, it was clear. The decoy operation had succeeded beyond expectation. Japanese captains were no longer commanding the battlefield. They were responding to it. The consequences of these hours of maneuvering would soon manifest in the broader engagement. Japanese ships had been drawn away from critical sectors. Reconnaissance had been misled, and their confidence shaken. The Americans, meanwhile, maintained full operational freedom, ready to exploit the openings created by the decoys. The stage was set for the decisive strike that would define the engagement, demonstrating how strategy, psychology, and deception could rival the force of guns and armor on the high seas. By mid-afternoon, the impact of the decoy fleets had reached its zenith. Japanese captains, previously confident in their assessments, now found themselves overextended and divided. Cruiser divisions had been lured hundreds of miles away from the real American carriers, while destroyer squadrons were tied up investigating phantom formations. Miscommunication between fleet commands compounded the problem, leaving key sectors unguarded and exposing vulnerabilities that the Americans were ready to exploit. The real strike force, including the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, remained hidden behind the horizon. From their concealed positions, American commanders observed the shifting Japanese formations, identifying the most critical gaps. Reconnaissance planes provided real-time updates, confirming that the decoy operation had successfully manipulated Japanese attention and forced an operational misalignment. It was a calculated patience. The Americans were playing the long game, letting their adversary commit to errors before striking decisively. Around 3 p.m. Japanese reconnaissance finally detected the actual American carriers. By then, however, the tactical landscape had already been shaped by misperception. Key Japanese cruisers and destroyers were out of position, unable to support each other, while aircraft prepared to engage empty waters. The surprise was not merely in sighting the hidden carriers, but in realizing the extent to which their previous assumptions had misled them. Captains who had relied on perceived strength and predictable movement patterns now faced a reality that contradicted every expectation. Human reactions were stark. Officers on Japanese bridges reported disbelief and shock. Some questioned whether reports were accurate. Others feared ambushes that had been artfully constructed. The decoy fleet's psychological effect, the confusion, the tension, the fear of the unseen, had achieved a result equivalent to a conventional strike. Japanese captains' hesitation allowed American carriers to advance into positions of maximum tactical advantage, a demonstration of strategic patience and deception triumphing over numerical parity. The Americans seized this advantage immediately. Aircraft from the hidden carriers launched reconnaissance and limited strikes, exploiting gaps created by the diversionary fleets. Japanese air patrols scrambled, only to encounter unexpected resistance and minimal targets where they had anticipated concentrated enemy ships. The disarray among Japanese forces limited their capacity to respond effectively, amplifying the impact of the decoy operation. By late afternoon, the results were clear. The decoy fleets had forced Japanese vessels into reactive movements, fractured their coordination, and sown operational confusion. Even without engaging in direct combat, the Americans had dictated the flow of the battle. Each miscalculated movement by the Japanese demonstrated the power of deception over conventional superiority. The psychological and tactical impact of this operation would resonate throughout the Pacific, illustrating how ingenuity and precise planning could offset disadvantages in numbers and firepower. The climax of the operation was not a single explosion or ship sinking, but the orchestration of misperception itself. Japanese captains, stunned by the invisible manipulation, had allowed the Americans to gain the initiative. What began as a morning of uncertainty had evolved into a decisive positioning advantage. The hidden carriers were now in place, Japanese formations were fragmented, and the Pacific waters were temporarily under American control. Not through direct confrontation, but through strategy, timing, and human psychology. As the day waned, the consequences of these actions would unfold in measurable terms. Misallocated ships, disrupted reconnaissance, and shaken confidence among Japanese commanders. The decoy fleets had achieved what few operations could, winning tactical advantage without the expenditure of massive firepower. This turning point exemplified the evolving nature of naval warfare in the Pacific, where perception could dictate reality, and ingenuity could surpass brute strength. The immediate results of the decoy operation were striking. Japanese captains, still reeling from the misdirection, faced the reality that significant portions of their fleet had been lured away from critical areas. Cruiser divisions that might have supported carrier groups were out of position, and destroyer squadrons tasked with reconnaissance had chased illusions rather than reality. The Americans, in contrast, maintained cohesion and readiness, their true carriers positioned optimally to exploit gaps in Japanese coverage. Reports from Japanese officers, intercepted and later analyzed, highlighted the confusion. Some ships had advanced hundreds of miles toward decoy formations, leaving vital sectors undefended. Radar and reconnaissance, relied upon for operational awareness, had been manipulated through calculated timing, selective movements, and visual cues. The combination of tactical feints, deceptive formations, and controlled radio silence had created an operational mirage. Japanese commanders realized, too late, that their assumptions had guided them into strategic errors. From a human perspective, the impact on Japanese crews was profound. Officers expressed disbelief, captains questioned intelligence reports, and sailors grappled with uncertainty that undermined confidence in leadership decisions. Even those not directly engaged with the decoy fleets were affected. The disruption of coordination and misallocation of resources created tension across the theater. Morale, which had been bolstered by early victories in the Pacific, was shaken by the realization that American ingenuity could rival numerical strength. For the United States Navy, the operation represented a triumph of strategy over brute force. The decoy fleets had achieved their intended purpose. They had drawn enemy attention, created operational openings, and allowed hidden carriers to maneuver freely. Damage and loss were minimal, yet the strategic gain was immense. By avoiding direct confrontation while dictating enemy movements, the Americans demonstrated the power of deception as a force multiplier in naval warfare. The decoy operation also exposed limitations in Japanese command and control. Conflicting reports between fleet commands delayed responses and prevented effective coordination. Key sectors were left underdefended, while vessels committed to investigating phantom threats could not respond to actual targets. This fragmentation highlighted a critical vulnerability. When an enemy controls perception, the advantage of numbers and firepower can be neutralized. In broader terms, the operation influenced subsequent tactical and strategic thinking. Allied planners took note of the effectiveness of deception in the Pacific, understanding that information control, psychological pressure, and calculated feints could be as decisive as direct engagement. The lessons extended beyond a single battle. They informed doctrine on fleet positioning, reconnaissance priorities, and the integration of intelligence into operational planning. The decoy fleets had achieved what few operations in naval history could claim. They forced the enemy into missteps without the exchange of gunfire, aircraft losses, or decisive bombardment. Yet the full consequences were only beginning to emerge. Japanese officers, grappling with operational errors and shattered assumptions, would reassess tactics, adjust deployments, and confront the reality that American ingenuity had redefined the balance of power in the theater. In the days following the decoy operation, the Japanese Navy faced a stark assessment of the consequences. Ships that had pursued phantom fleets returned to port depleted of fuel and supplies, while cruisers and destroyers assigned to critical patrols had missed opportunities to intercept the real American carriers. Fleet commanders recognized that overconfidence, reliance on predictable patterns, and underestimation of American ingenuity had combined to create operational failure. Reports from senior officers noted frustration and astonishment at how the Americans had manipulated perception so effectively. Strategically, the operation shifted the balance in the Pacific, if only subtly at first. By preserving their main carriers and positioning them advantageously, the United States ensured that subsequent strikes could be executed with a higher probability of success. Japanese forces, forced into reaction rather than initiative, were left on the defensive. The disruption to their formations and coordination revealed vulnerabilities in command and control that would influence future engagements, including carrier battles and island campaigns later in 1942. Psychologically, the impact on Japanese naval leadership was profound. Officers had grown accustomed to assuming American movements were predictable. The decoy fleets shattered this assumption, introducing a level of unpredictability and confusion that had immediate operational effects. Morale among Japanese crews, though resilient, was tempered by the realization that the enemy could achieve tactical advantage through intelligence and cunning rather than sheer numbers. This shift in perception would echo through future planning, forcing Japanese commanders to reconsider reliance on traditional doctrines and visual reconnaissance. From the American perspective, the success of the decoy operation reinforced the value of unconventional tactics. Intelligence-driven maneuvers, calculated misdirection, and careful coordination of visual cues had allowed a smaller, weakened force to achieve a disproportionate strategic advantage. The operation became an early example of how psychological operations could shape outcomes in naval warfare, influencing training, planning, and doctrine in the months and years that followed. Officers analyzed the lessons extensively, codifying procedures for deception, reconnaissance manipulation, and fleet coordination to maximize operational flexibility. Historical reports and declassified documents later confirmed the operation's effectiveness. Japanese logs and post-war analyses described surprise and confusion among fleet captains, with repeated references to misjudged distances, phantom ship sightings, and unexpected American positions. The decoy fleets, though small in terms of tonnage and firepower, had a strategic impact far beyond their size, demonstrating that perception management could be as decisive as direct engagement. The aftermath also highlighted broader lessons in naval warfare. Control of information, manipulation of enemy expectations, and the orchestration of human and technological factors proved critical. The success of the decoy fleets emphasized that victory often depended as much on creativity and psychological insight as on the quantity of ships or the size of the armament. For both the Japanese and American navies, the episode became a reference point for understanding the evolving nature of conflict in the vast Pacific theater. Ultimately, the decoy operation reshaped not only immediate tactical realities, but also the strategic thinking of both sides. Japanese captains, stunned by what they had witnessed, had to adjust their doctrines, while American commanders recognized the potential of deception as a force multiplier. The engagement left a lasting mark on naval history, a testament to the power of careful planning, precise execution, and the mastery of perception over raw strength. The decoy fleets of early 1942 exemplify the profound intersection of strategy, psychology, and human perception in warfare. They remind us that victory is not always measured in explosions or sunken ships, but in the subtle orchestration of expectation and misdirection. Japanese captains, seasoned and confident, were confronted with a reality they could not immediately comprehend, a reality shaped entirely by the Americans' deliberate control of information, timing, and visual cues. This operation underscores the evolution of naval warfare in the Pacific. In an ocean spanning thousands of miles, where traditional reconnaissance was limited and communication slow, perception became a weapon. The Americans demonstrated that even a numerically inferior force could dictate the pace and positioning of battle through careful planning and innovation. It was a lesson in patience, precision, and understanding human psychology, where the manipulation of belief became as lethal as any artillery strike. Beyond the tactical and operational impacts, the decoy fleets leave a lasting reflection on human ingenuity in war. They show how creativity, discipline, and coordination can offset material disadvantages, and how understanding the mindset of an opponent can redefine the battlefield. The Japanese response, stunned, disoriented, and overextended, reveals how even experienced commanders are vulnerable to carefully engineered deception. Ultimately, this episode is more than a historical footnote. It is a study in strategy and the art of anticipation. The decoy fleets not only influenced the immediate outcomes in the Pacific, but also left enduring lessons for military planning, intelligence operations, and psychological warfare. In the vast expanse of the ocean, where sight can deceive and assumptions can mislead, the true strength of a fleet often lies not in its guns, but in the cunning of its commanders and the discipline of its crews. In that quiet tension across the Pacific waters, with shadows of ships gliding under the morning mist, history was shaped not by brute force alone, but by a mastery of perception. A reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are won before a shot is ever fired.